Hi everybody, we're going to be continuing to talk about plant physiology, and today we're going to focus on some of the adaptations that plants have to survive in their environments, as well as how plants transport water and how they transport sugars, okay? So you guys have a note sheet, and you won't need it quite yet. There's a few things we have to talk about before that. All right, so here's a fallen redwood tree. You can see it has a huge mass. I mean, if this is a normal person, you can see just how wide that is, how many people standing on end that would take to reach the top of this. Now, imagine how much this tree weighs. Just imagine a number of pounds, let's say, in your head. Where did that mass come from? This tree is dry. So all this wood, all this xylem here, all the bark, where did that mass come from? It's dried out, so it's not from the water. So hopefully you guys said it's from CO2. So interestingly enough, the dry mass of a plant is mostly the carbon and the oxygen that came from the air. So you can imagine that trees are responsible for putting away pounds and pounds, literally pounds and pounds of carbon dioxide stored in their tissues. Okay, and when these decompose, well, somebody, probably some kind of decomposer, a fungus, a bacteria, they're going to do cellular respiration and release all this carbon, all this oxygen back into the air. Okay, so it's a fine balance between trees and consumers for, making sure that CO2 taken in is the same as CO2 produced. And as we know right now, there's a huge discrepancy. So we're putting in way more CO2 into the atmosphere than the trees are taking in. It's off balance and we have to fix it, although our current administration doesn't seem very interested in that. Well, let's keep going. So in the last set of notes, you guys learned about all the different parts of the tree. So I want to talk about a few adaptations and things that plants do that are a little out of the ordinary. And so we learned already about how these trumpet plants, they have modified their leaves. So there was probably a mutation way back when that made a tube-shaped leaf, and it actually helped these plants because, these are swamp plants. So anytime insects get stuck in here, they actually do a lot better because they're going to absorb all that nitrogen that insect brings because their soil is not very rich. But generally speaking, this is just a leaf that it's modified. It didn't choose to modify it. It was just a mutation that happened to be helpful and was passed down through the generations. And evolution is our next unit, so I'm going to try to frame a lot of this in evolutionary terms, okay? All right, now here's a poinsettia from Christmas, and you might think these are just, this is just a flower. This is a poinsettia flower. These are petals. And so it turns out they're not really petals, and they're really just leaves, because if you look, the petals and everything are here. These are each individual flowers. So this is kind of a compound flower, and the leaves have been basically just modified. And petals in general are modified leaves. So they basically just put a colorful pigment in there instead of chlorophyll, and that's to attract the pollinators, okay? So plants can't move, obviously, so they have to have a lot of creative ways of getting animals and, insects and birds to do their pollinating for them. All right, so here's a cactus, and these spines here are actually modified leaves as well. So these are leaves that have sort of rolled up, and they've got a huge waxy cuticle and a lot of woody, tough tissue here on these spines. And you can see there's not very much chlorophyll in here. They're pretty light in color because they need to, reflect the sun's light. It's too hot here. They can't get too hot. So the more white they are, the better, because they're going to reflect those rays. And even their shape right here is kind of interesting. So they've really minimized surface area to volume ratio. And so they don't want to be too flat, because otherwise they would absorb too much of the sun's heat. So as the sun shines from above, there's only a very, very small surface that's actually going to get hot. So this part's going to get hot. Everything under will remain relatively cool. So it's no accident that cactuses are actually shaped in this barrel form. Plus it keeps all the water underneath cool. Now, let's move on to roots. What are some cool things that happen with roots? So this is like a bog. And remember when we talked about the Venus flytrap and all that, we said there's not very many microorganisms living down here in the soil because it's waterlogged. So the water blocks a lot of the oxygen going into the soil. And so roots even need oxygen. So these are aerating roots. These roots grow out of the ground, and this is how the roots absorb oxygen. So basically, plants do both photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis provides the food, cellular respiration will then provide ATP. So one of the main reasons you don't want to overwater your plant is because you might starve out the roots. They won't get enough oxygen. And plus bacteria and stuff will start growing, like things will start rotting in here, and it's not going to be good for the plant. So aerating roots, those are kind of cool. Now roots also, so this is the main taproot, and they're going to have, these things are called root hairs. Okay, so these maximize surface area to volume ratio. These guys are going to keep branching to basically utilize every single little surface of the soil. Now, this is just regular roots. These roots you can see are kind of dense. They actually have fungus growing on them. And so the fungus, this is a symbiotic relationship. It's mutualistic, meaning that both organisms are going to benefit. So the fungi get to steal a little bit of the sugars from the root. So the fungi are going to benefit because this is kind of a little bit of a food source for them. But the plant doesn't mind it because they actually help. So all the fungal hyphae, we call their cells hyphae. I know that sounds funny, but fungal cells kind of do this branching thing. And the hyphae, the fungal hyphae, are going to grow around the roots and actually attract water. Okay, so these can really help to increase the surface area of the roots. So it's a good symbiotic relationship. Now, these are called prop roots. These are called adventitious roots. Anytime a root grows above ground, it's called adventitious. So there's a couple reasons for that. One is to aerate. This plant, this natively grows somewhere where the soil's not very stable. It's kind of sandy. And so these prop roots kind of help hold everything up so it can grow tall enough to do photosynthesis. All right, and of course normal roots are going to store a bunch of the starch, a bunch of the sugars that are made from photosynthesis. So carrots are kind of an extreme example. We keep selecting for fatter and more sugary carrots. And so over generations and generations, carrots don't really look like what they did when, for instance, the Native Americans were growing them. So they've gotten much bigger, much fatter, much, better tasting. All right, now another symbiotic relationship. This is actually a legume. Remember, legumes are beans. And the great thing about legumes and why they're pretty vital for almost every ecosystem is that in their roots, these are called legume nodules. Inside these nodules are bacteria, okay? They're called rhizobium. Okay, so these bacteria do nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen in the air is in the form of N2. We breathe that and breathe it out. We never take this in. So we cannot use nitrogen gas, and neither can plants. So what happens is these rhizobium take in the nitrogen gas and do nitrogen fixation. So you might remember this process. Nitrogen fixation is where we take N2 from the air and we turn that into nitrate. Okay, now nitrate can actually go into the root and be used to make proteins and DNA. So any protein, any nucleic acid is going to require nitrogen. Okay, and this is how the plant's going to make it. And so we get our nitrogen by eating, could be legumes or other plants. And so farmers always make sure that they plant lots of legumes around their plants, or even like alternate seasons. One season they'll grow legumes, and that's going to nourish the soil, and then the next year they'll plant corn or whatever. So they always rotate and make sure legumes are in the rotation. They're super good for the soil. Okay, now let's talk about stems. So this is a spider plant, and stems that grow like this are called stolons. So stolons are for asexual reproduction. So it's going to send a stem out, and this is going to land and root on the ground, although I think this is sitting on carpet. But that's what it's trying to do. And so eventually, once this takes root, it'll cut off and abscise this stem, and it'll grow into a whole new genetically identical plant. It's not ideal because they're going to be in competition, but they try to send them out as far as they can. So this plant can do both asexual and sexual reproduction. And by the way, anytime you see these white parts, you might be thinking, why would you want white? I mean, shouldn't that be green? And that's true, it should. White is going to reflect all of the rays. So this is actually a mutation, and gardeners basically select for that mutation. And so this is called variegation. So it's basically some albino cells in here. All right, so some more stems. This is a ginger plant. This is called a rhizoid. This is a stem that's basically growing underground. So it's an underground stem, and it's going to just grow and grow and grow and send shoots up. All right, and every fall, these are going to fall in summer. These are going to fall down. The rhizoid stays in there, and the roots stay in there. And you'll see this a lot of times with daffodils growing on the side of the road. They'll grow in bunches. So if you go underneath the daffodils, you would find this big rhizoid down there. And so ginger kind of grows the same way. It just keeps growing horizontally. All right, now let's talk about, I'm going to skip some of this. Sorry, don't mind this. Aha. Okay, let's get to this picture. You guys have that in your notes. Now, let's take a look at what's going on here. So this is a stem right here. Okay. The cambium. Cambium is very important. This is actually the vascular cambium. And this is the tissue that does lateral growth. Okay, which is also called secondary growth. Okay, so this is going to make the stem wider. And so the cambium basically does mitosis, over and over and over mitosis. And the new cells are going to grow this way to make xylem. Any cells on this side are going to make phloem. Okay, so if this were to divide in two, this new cell would become more phloem, and we would create basically another layer here. Okay, and this would grow outwards. All right, so cambium is, it's kind of like a germline cell. So it's going to be, all the cells are going to germinate from this layer here. All right, phloem is the tissue that carries sugars. Okay, so that's carried on the outside. Xylem is going to carry water, as we know. All right, and the pith is in the middle. That's just sort of structural tissue, okay? And the epidermis is protective there. All right? Okay, so now this is phloem. Okay, this is how phloem works, and it's called bulk flow. Okay, so remember phloem is sugar, right? Sugar is going to move through the phloem. I want to draw your attention over here. So these cells right here, basically, they don't have anything in them. They're pretty hollowed out. They're still alive. They're still considered alive here, but they don't have like a nucleus. They don't have a lot of the organelles. So basically, they've emptied out this section of cells here, okay? So this is phloem right here. Okay, and these cells are called sieve tube. Sieve tube members. Okay, this is called a companion cell. Okay, the companion cell contains the nucleus and other organelles. Okay, so it's going to do the major work of the cell. And the sieve tube members are just going to be adapted for transporting sugars, okay? Now, here's what's going to happen. The leaf is going to make sugars through photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis happens, light reactions, Calvin cycle, sugar is going to be produced, right? We're going to actively